The Tiger of Mysore by G.A. Henty. Chapter 7. Besieged. Dick hastily clambered up the wall, ran to the gate, blew the tinder, and then applied it to the slow match. A moment later this began to fizz. "Round the corner of the wall, Surajah!" he exclaimed, running back himself. A few anxious seconds passed, then came a sharp explosion. In an instant they ran up. The gate stood 2 or 3 inches open. It yielded to a push, and they ran out. Loud shouts were heard from the men above, and a hubbub of cries from the guardhouse. "Run, Surajah! We must risk it. Keep on the edge of the road, and dodge as you go. The chances are they will run down below to see what has happened." At the top of their speed they dashed down the road. No shot was fired from the wall. Dick's conjecture that the first impulse of the sentries would be to run down below having been justified. They were a couple of 100 yards away before 2 shots were fired from the gate. The bullets whistled by harmlessly. "We're all right now," Dick cried. "They can scarcely see us, and we shall soon be out of sight altogether." 5 or 6 more shots were fired a few seconds later as the men from the guardhouse reached the gate. On looking back, when they had gone another 100 yards, they saw a number of figures on the road. "Not quite so fast, Surajah," Dick said. "It's going to be a long chase now. We have got 300 yards start, and they won't be able to load again running at full speed." For a time their pursuers gained somewhat upon them. Then gradually they began to straggle, as the effect of the speed at which they were running told upon them. When they reached the ruined village there were 4 men running together, some 300 yards behind. The rest were a considerable distance in the rear. "Another mile or 2 and they'll all give up the chase except these 4, Surajah, and if they turn out to be better runners than we do, we can make a stand. There are some more huts another 2 miles further on, and we'll fight them there." They were going slower now, for although the downward course of the road helped them a good deal, the run was telling on them. Not a word was spoken until they reached the second village. When they came to the first house they stopped simultaneously and looked around. Their pursuers were not more than 200 yards behind them. "In here, Surajah," Dick said, as he ran into the ruined hut. Its roof was gone. Its door hung loose on its hinges. It had but one window, a small one looking up the valley. Dick laid his gun on the sill, which was nearly level with his shoulder. "I must wait until they get pretty close," he said, "for I am panting so that I can't keep the barrel steady, even with this rest." "I will kneel down outside," Surajah said. "Mind, I will fire first, Surajah. Don't you fire until they are within 20 yards of you. By that time I shall have loaded again." Dick had more time than he had expected, for as soon as their pursuers saw them enter the hut, they slackened their pace considerably. They were within about 80 yards when Dick held his breath, and standing for a moment immovable, took a steady aim and fired. One of the men stumbled in his run, took a step or 2 forward, then fell on his face. The others paused for a moment, and then, with a fierce yell, ran forward. The moment he had fired, Dick dropped the stock of his gun onto the ground, snatched a cartridge from the bandolier, bit off the end, and emptied the powder into the barrel, gave the gun a shake so as to be sure that it ran into the touch hole, and then rammed down the bullet. As he was in the act of doing so, Surajah fired, and a loud yell told that his shot had been successful. Dick sprang to the door as Surajah entered. 2 shots at the same instant rang out, but at even so short a distance the bullets went wide. Dick stepped out and in turn fired. One of the 2 remaining men fell. The other threw down his musket and fled up the road. "Oh, thank goodness that is over!" Dick exclaimed. "I thought they had no chance with us, and here now the first thing is to get our wind again." They stood for 2 or 3 minutes, breathing heavily. Then, as their breath came again, they prepared to move, when Dick exclaimed suddenly, What is that noise?" There was a dull, confused sound in the air, and then Surajah, pointing up the road, exclaimed, "Cavalry!" Far away on the white road a dark mass could be seen. At first Dick instinctively turned to resume their flight, but then he said, "It's of no use, Surajah. The sides of the valley are too steep to climb, and they'll be up in 5 or 6 minutes. We must fight it out here. Run out to that man I shot, and bring in his gun, bandolier, pistols if he has any, and sword. I'll take them from these 2. It'll make all the difference having spare weapons." Surajah, without a word, hurried up the road, while Dick ran over to the house opposite, which seemed to be larger than the one they had first entered. He looked round. It contained only 1 room, but this was 20 feet square. There were 3 small windows, one looking into the street, one looking up the valley, and one behind. The floor was littered with the beams of the roof. The door was still in its place. Having ascertained this, he ran back to the bodies of the 2 men, picked up the 3 guns, took off their bandoliers, and removed the pistols from their sashes, and with these and one of their swords returned to the house, just as Surajah came back. "This is the best house to defend, Surajah. There are some beams with which we can block up the door." Laying down the arms inside, they set to work with the beams and barricaded the door so firmly that, short of its being splintered to pieces, no entry could be effected. This done, they recharged the 6 guns, examined the pistols, and finding that they were loaded, placed 3 of them in each of their sashes, and hung the swords by their sides. Then they went to the window looking up the valley. The horsemen, some 20 in number, were but a short quarter of a mile away, and were coming along at a gallop. "Don't fire, Surajah," Dick said. "They will have heard, from the man who has got away, that we are in the house opposite, and if they don't find us there, they will think that we have gone on, and will ride down the valley till they are sure they must be ahead of us. Then they will search the ground carefully as they come back, and although we may gain an hour, and every moment is of use, it must be 2 o'clock now, and our troop generally gets here soon after 7. As he spoke, the horsemen drew up in front of the opposite hut. There was a momentary pause, and then a voice said, "It is empty." Then followed the command, "Ride on, men, they can't have got far. We shall overtake them in 10 minutes." As soon as they started, Dick said, "Take a ramrod, Surajah, and make some holes through the walls to fire through. If we were to show ourselves at the windows, we might get shot." The walls were built of mud and clay, and with the iron ramrods they had no difficulty in making 4 holes, an inch wide and 2 inches high, on each side of the house. "Now we are ready for them," Dick said, when they had finished. "They have been gone half an hour, and it won't be long before they are back." In a few minutes they heard the clatter of horses' hoofs. It ceased some 40 or 50 yards away, and by the sound of voices and orders, it was evident that the other houses were being searched. Voices were also heard at the back of the house, and they guessed that the ground was being closely examined, up to the foot of the rock walls which enclosed the valley. "Now, Surajah, you can take a shot from the window of that side. The others will be here in a minute, and it's just as well to let them know where we are before they get close up to our door." Surajah went to the window at the back. 4 horsemen were making their way at a walk along the level ground between the rocks and the huts. The nearest was but some 40 yards away. Surajah fired, and the man at once fell from his horse. The others instantly galloped on at full speed up the valley, and from the window at the end Surajah saw them gather on the road 300 or 400 yards away, and then, after a short consultation, crossed to the other side of the valley, with the intention, he had no doubt, of rejoining their comrades. The sound of the gun had been followed by shouts and exclamations from the party in the village. Dick could hear a conference in low tones, then all was silent. He went to the loophole at the corner, laid his rifle in it, and waited, looking along the barrel. 2 or 3 minutes later the hole was darkened, and he fired at once. There was a sound of a heavy fall, followed by cries of rage, and a moment later there was a rush of men against the door. Surajah ran across. 2 spare guns were pushed through the loopholes, 1 on each side of it. These had not been bored straight through the wall, but at angles that would enable them to fire at anyone attacking it. Looking along the barrels, each could see one of the group in front, and fired at the same moment. With a yell of rage and surprise, the assailants of the door sprang back and ran down the street. "Well, there are 4 less now, anyway," Dick said, as he and Surajah reloaded the empty guns. "Those loopholes will puzzle them, and I don't think they'll care to come on again for a bit." There was a pause for some minutes, and then from the huts opposite, and from various points higher up the valley and behind, a dropping fire was opened. "Keep out of the line of the windows, whatever you do, Surajah, and it will be just as well to lie down for a bit until we see whether any of their shots come through the wall. I think we are quite safe from the distant fire, but from the house opposite it's possible they may penetrate it. Anyhow, don't stand in the line of a loophole. A stray ball might find its way in." For a few minutes the enemy fired away unanswered, and then Dick, who had been seated on the ground with his back against the end wall, got up and went along that facing the street, carefully examining it. "I don't think any of their balls have come through, Surajah. I should be able to see out into the moonlight if they had done so. Now it's time for us to be doing something. I expect they are getting a little bolder, and will perhaps give us a chance. You take this loophole. It's exactly in a line with the opposite hut, and the fellows in there must come to their door to fire. I'll take this slanting hole by the doorpost. I can see one of the windows of the next hut that we are in. I have no doubt that they are firing from there also. Don't wait for them to shoot, but fire directly a figure shows itself." In a very short time Surajah fired. Dick heard the clatter of a gun as it fell to the ground. "You've hit him, Surajah." "Yes, but only wounded him. I think I hit him in the shoulder. He let his gun drop and ran into the house." "Take a spare gun at once. If there are others there, they will think you are loading, and may show themselves again." A moment later Dick saw a gun thrust out through the window he was watching. Then the head and shoulders of a man appeared behind it. Dick fired, and the figure disappeared. Almost at the same time Surajah fired again. "I had one that time, Sahib." It was now quiet for some little time. Then a horseman dashed suddenly past and galloped up the valley at full speed. "The end window, Surajah. Bring him down if you can." Surajah ran there and fired. "I have missed him," he said in a tone of deep disappointment. Well, it doesn't make much difference. If you had hit him, they could have sent another off close to the opposite side of the valley. There is no doubt as to what he has gone for. You see, they've lost 6 and 1 wounded. They must know that they have not the slightest chance of taking this hut. I have no doubt he has ridden back to bring down the infantry from the fort. From the number of huts round the gate and the sound of talking, I should think they were 50 or 60 at least, perhaps 100. If they send down 50, we shall have sharp work. Our difficulty will be to prevent them from making a rush at all the windows together. If they were to get there, they could riddle us with balls." "Could we block them up, Sahib?" "That's just what I was thinking. We might try, anyhow. It'll be an hour and a half before they're down here. It must be past 4 now. In another hour daybreak will begin. There's any amount of the old thatch down by the floor. The best way would be to fill up the window holes with it first, then to put 2 or 3 bits of wood across and a strong piece down behind it, and to keep that in its place by wedging one of the long beams against it. If they come up and try to pull the thatch out, we can fire through it with our pistols, and we'll make a loophole below each when we've got the work done." It was not so difficult a business as they thought it would be. The windows were little more than a foot across and 2 feet high. It was but the work of a few minutes to fill these up with the masses of thatch. When this was done, they picked out thick pieces of wood for crossbars. Then they took a beam 8 feet long, made a hole with their tulwars in the clay floor close to the wall, put one end of the beam into it, and reared it upright against the window. Dick held it in place while Surajah hacked a deep notch in it, a by no means difficult matter, for it was half rotten with exposure. The notch was cut just opposite the middle of the window. The 3 cross pieces were then put into their place, and the upright pressed firmly against them. One end of a long beam was placed in the notch, and the other in a slight hole made in the ground, thus forming a strut which held the rest firmly in their positions. "That's a good job done," Dick said, "but a very hot one. Now, Surajah, sharpen 3 or 4 pieces of wood, and drive them down into the ground at the foot of that strut. Then it will be as firm as a rock." They then proceeded in the same way with the other 2 windows. "It's getting light fast," Dick said as he wiped the perspiration from his face. "Take a look out up the valley. They ought to be coming by this time." Surajah applied his eye to one of the loopholes. "Oh, I can see them. They're half a mile away. There are 2 mounted men. I expect one is their officer, and the other the man who rode back to fetch him." "Let us set to work at the loopholes under the windows, Surajah. It's most important to get them done. You make the one at the end. I'll do that one looking into the street. Put it as close to the beam as you can." They worked hard, and it was not long before the walls were pierced. "Now, Surajah, you do the one at the back. The fellows will soon be within range, and I'll give them a lesson to be careful. They will naturally break up and go round behind the houses opposite, as they can find shelter nowhere else, and for a bit, at any rate, we shall get them all on one side of us, which is what we want." Dick carried the 6 guns to the end of the hut, and then applied his eye to the loophole there. The enemy were coming along at a run in a confused mass. "I can't very well miss them," he muttered to himself, as he thrust his gun through a loophole and fired. Without waiting to see the result, he thrust another gun out, aimed, and fired. "Never mind the hole, Surajah," he said. "Come here and reload." The 4 other shots were discharged in rapid succession. The Mysoreans at first opened an irregular fire on the hut. When the 6th shot was fired, they left the road in a body and ran across the valley, leaving 4 of their number on the ground behind them. As soon as the guns were reloaded, Surajah returned to his work. It was now broad daylight, and the sun was shining upon the hilltops. A quarter of an hour passed without a movement from the enemy. Dick and his companion occupied the time in further strengthening the door with crossbeams, kept in their place by struts. "If they break it to splinters," Dick said, when they had finished, "they'll hardly be able to force their way in, for if they were able to try to crawl in between those crossbeams, they'd be completely at our mercy. Now, we must get ready for a rush. I expect they'll come all together. There are the 6 guns and 3 pistols each. Keep one of the latter in reserve. We ought not to waste a shot, and if they lose 10 men, I should think they'll give up the attack on the door. Stand clear of it, Surajah. They'll probably fire into it before they charge. Keep down below the level of the loopholes." Presently a volley of musketry was fired, and the door was riddled by bullets. Then a number of figures sprang from between the 2 opposite houses and rushed at the door. 2 of them carried a long, heavy beam. 2 shots flashed out in return from the hut. One of the men carrying the beam fell, as did an officer who was leading them, but instantly another caught up the end of the timber, and in a moment a crowd were clustered round the door. Several caught hold of the beam and swung it as though they meant to use it as a battering ram. 2 more puffs of smoke spurted out from the loopholes, and again 2 of the men fell. 2 others, however, swung it forward with a crash against the door. The end of the beam went right through the rotten woodwork. Dick and Surajah fired their last musket shots with as deadly effect as before. The next blow dashed the door from its hinges, and, split and shattered by the former shocks, it fell forward into the road, while a yell of triumph broke from the Mysoreans. This died away, however, when they saw the 3 crossbars blocking their entrance. Again 2 pistol shots carried death among them. "Load your guns, Surajah." But before Surajah had time to do so, the Mysoreans made a rush at the door. The defenders stepped forward and fired between the crossbars, and then, drawing their tulwars, ran the 2 men in front through the body. As they dropped, those behind them drew back. "The last pistols!" Dick shouted, and they fired 2 shots into the crowd. This completed the consternation of the enemy. It seemed to them that the defenders possessed an unlimited supply of firearms. Already 12 shots had been fired, and not one had failed to take effect. With a cry of consternation they fled down the street, leaving the ground in front of the fatal door strewn with bodies. The defenders instantly set about the work of recharging their firearms. They were not interrupted, but presently an irregular fire opened upon them from the jungle that had taken the place of the garden between the opposite houses. "We may as well lie down at full length," Dick said, setting the example. "There's no use in running risks. You keep that side and listen attentively. It's likely enough that they'll work round behind next time and try the windows. By the way they are firing, I fancy they are not more than 5 or 6 of them opposite." Another half hour passed. Then Surajah exclaimed, "I can hear them on this side." Dick got up and crossed at once. "I'll take the loophole under this window. You go to the one at the end. I expect they'll try both windows at once." Dick placed the muzzle of his gun in the loophole, and, glancing along, saw that something dark barred his view. He fired at once. There was a loud cry and a fall, then a rush to the window, and a moment later a hole appeared in the thatch. Dick discharged 2 pistols through it, and as he did so, Surajah fired. The thatch was speedily pulled down, as the enemy had learned to avoid the loopholes. A yell of rage rose as the fallen thatch showed them that the window was defended with crossbars in the same way as the door. Immediately afterwards, Dick had a narrow escape from a shot fired through a loophole close to him. "Stoop down," he cried, and, crouching below the level of the loopholes, made his way to the end of the hut. "Recharge the guns first, Surajah. They may fire away through the loopholes as long as they like. It's lucky we made them so high, except the 3 under the windows. We must be careful in keeping out of the line of those. You sit down where you can command the end window and the one behind. I'll watch the front window and the door. A bold fellow might put his musket through and pick one of us off, and that's what we have to prevent. So keep your gun in readiness, and if you see a head appear, don't miss it." The enemy now kept up a constant fire through the loopholes at the end and back of the house, but as these were shoulder high and there was no altering the elevation of the guns, the shots flew harmlessly over the heads of the defenders. Several times, in fact, Dick went to one or the other of the loopholes, pistol in hand, and, standing close beside it, waited until a shot was fired, and then, thrusting the barrel into the loophole, fired before another gun could be inserted, the discharge being generally followed by a sharp cry of pain. After this had gone on for nearly an hour, the assailants evidently became discouraged. The shots came from the loopholes less frequently, and presently ceased altogether. "I would give a good deal to know what they are up to," Dick said, after a long pause. "Shall I look through the loopholes?" Surajah asked. "Certainly not. There will be a man standing at each of them, waiting in expectation of our taking a lookout. But there are none in front. That's more than we can say. They have not been firing on that side, but they may have men there now. No, we'll leave well enough alone, Surajah. The longer they delay, the better for us. Keep your eye on the top of the wall, as well as on the window. They may have made some ladders by this time, and may intend to try a shot." "Perhaps they are gone?" Surajah suggested. "Well, it's quite possible. They must know that our troop comes up here early, and as they have 4 miles to walk back to the fort, and several wounded to carry with them, they certainly won't stay much longer, if, as you say, they have not gone already." It was indeed well that Surajah had not attempted to look out at one of the loopholes, for, at the time he asked the question, a dark figure was standing at each, looking along the barrel of his gun, in readiness to fire the moment the light was obscured. A few minutes later, Dick exclaimed, "How stupid! We can easily test whether there is any one of there, Surajah," and, taking up a piece of thatch, he pushed it suddenly across one of the loopholes. No shot followed the action, and he went round the hut and repeated the experiment at each of them. "They've all gone," he said confidently. "Had they been outside, they would certainly have fired directly the light was obscured." Standing a short distance back from the end window, he looked out between the crossbeams. "Hooray!" he shouted. "There they go up the road. They're a quarter of a mile away. They're not more than half as strong as they were when they came down, and they're carrying 8 or 10 figures on their shoulders, on litters or doors." "I don't see the cavalry," Surajah said, as he joined him. "No, it's likely enough that they may be in hiding among the huts opposite, and are waiting in hopes that we may be foolish enough to take it for granted that they are all gone, and pull down the bars of the door. I expect they'll stay until they see our troop coming up the valley." They continued to look out from the window, from which they had now removed the bars. Half an hour later Dick exclaimed, "There they go, up that side of the valley. I have no doubt they saw our troop, and that in a few minutes we shall hear them coming." It was not long before they heard a trampling of horses, and a moment later the Rajah's voice exclaimed, "Why, what is this? Here are a dozen dead bodies. They are Mysoreans by their dress." "All right, Uncle," Dick shouted. "We'll be out as soon as we get these bars down. We've been standing a siege." It did not take long to remove the bars. The Rajah and his men had dismounted as soon as some of the latter had gone round the hut, and had brought back the report that there were 5 more dead on that side. As Dick and his companion stepped out, the Rajah explained, "What, are you alone?" "Yes, there is no one with us, Uncle." "Do you mean to say that you two have defended this place alone, and killed 16 of the enemy, besides some I see lying farther up the road?" "Yes, Uncle. You see, it was a pretty strong position, and we had time to block up the doors and windows, and to make loopholes to fire through." "What do you think of that, Anwar?" the Rajah explained to the captain of the troop. "My nephew and Rajbullub's son have shown themselves brave fighters, have they not?" "It is wonderful," the captain said, and exclamations of admiration broke from the men standing round. "Tell us all about it, Dick," the Rajah went on. "Well, it's a long story, Uncle, but the real news is that Tippoo, with his army, has left the head of the western passes, and has gone to Seringapatam. He is going to march down one of the passes this side at once. Provisions have been collected for his army to consume on the march. No one knows yet which pass he will come down by, but it will not be far from here, for they are buying up cattle in the villages at the top of the ghauts." "That is important indeed, Dick, and we must ride off without delay. But first I must have a look at this fortress of yours." He entered the hut, the soldiers crowding in after him, and examined the defences at the windows and the loopholes, while Dick explained how the bars had been arranged to defend the door. "We began on the other side, Uncle. We had a fight with 4 men who came up with us there. Only one of them got away, and he left his gun behind. It was lucky, for their guns and pistols were of immense use to us. We could not have held out with only our own weapons. About 20 of their cavalry came up a few minutes afterward. We beat them back, and then they sent up to the fort for infantry, and about 50 men came down and attacked us just at sunrise. They kept it up to within half an hour ago. Then the infantry marched back, knowing, of course, that your troop generally got here about 7. The horsemen stayed here till within a few minutes of your arrival. No doubt they thought that we should suppose they had all gone, and might venture out and let them get a shot at us." "Why, it must have been a veritable battle, Dick." "Well, there was a good deal of noise, Uncle, though not much danger. So long as we kept below the level of the loopholes and windows, and out of the line of the door, there was no chance of our being hit." "They must have made a strong attack on the door," the Rajah said. "I see that the 2 lying next to it were both killed by sword thrusts." "Yes, that was the most critical moment, Uncle. We had emptied nearly all our barrels, and if they could have broken down the bars, which I have no doubt they could have done, if they had stuck to it, they would have made very short work of us. Now, let us be going," the Rajah said. "You can tell me the whole story as we go along." 2 of the sowars were ordered to give up their horses to Dick and Surajah, and to mount behind comrades. Then they started down the valley, Dick riding between his uncle and the captain, while Surajah took his place with the 2 other officers of the troop. They rode so rapidly that Dick's story was scarcely concluded by the time they reached the village where the troops were quartered. "Well, you have done marvellously well, Dick," his uncle said. "Surajah deserves the highest praise, too. Now I will write a note to the British officer with the Nabob, giving the news of Tippoo's movements, and will send it off by 2 of the troopers at once. Where Colonel Maxwell's force is, I have no idea. It marched to join General Meadows on the day we came up here. In the meantime, you can have a wash while breakfast is cooking. I have no doubt that you are ready for it." "I am indeed, Uncle. We have had nothing yesterday but a few cakes made of flour and water, and have nothing at all since." "All right, lad. I will be ready almost as soon as breakfast is." After the meal was over, the Rajah lit his hookah and said, "You must go through the story again this evening, Dick. You cut short some of the details, as you told it to me on the road, and I want to understand it all thoroughly. You had better turn in now for a long sleep. You must want it badly enough, lad, after the work of the last 2 nights." Dick slept until his uncle roused him at 6 o'clock. "Dinner will be ready in 10 minutes. It's just as well that you should get up for 2 or 3 hours. After that, you will be good for another sleep till morning. We shall have to look out sharp now, and keep a couple of vedettes always at that village, as, for all we know, this may be the pass by which Tippoo is coming down." Dick got up rather reluctantly, but he was not long in shaking off his drowsiness, and after dinner was able to go through the story again, with full details of his adventures. "I don't know what I should have done without Surajah, Uncle. He is a capital fellow, and if ever I go up by myself into Mysore to look for my father, I hope that you will let me take him." "That I will certainly do, Dick. Ever since I first heard of your plans, I have quite decided that you ought not to go alone. I dare say I should have chosen an older man to accompany you, but after what you and the lad have done together, I don't think you could do better than take him. Of course, such an affair would demand infinitely greater caution and care, though not greater courage, than you had occasion to use on this excursion. It's one thing to enter a village, to ask a few questions, make a purchase or two, and be off again, but it is a very different thing to be among people for weeks or perhaps months, and to live as one of themselves. However, we may hope that this war will end in our army marching to Seringapatam, when we shall recover many of the prisoners in Tippoo's hands. I do not say all. We know how many hundreds remained in his power last time, in spite of his promise to deliver them all up, and maybe something of the same sort will occur next time. Numbers may be sent away by him to the hill fortresses dotted all over the country, and we should never be able to obtain news of them. However, we must hope for the best." The next morning the troop arrived with a letter from the English resident at Arcot. The Rajah glanced through it and handed it to Dick with the remark, "You will not get the honour you deserve, Dick." The letter ran: "Dear Rajah, your news would be extremely valuable were it correct, but unfortunately it is not so, and doubtless the reports brought down by your nephew were spread by Tippoo for the purpose of deceiving us, or possibly he may have intended to come that way, but afterwards changed his mind. We have news that, just after Colonel Maxwell effected his junction with General Meadows near Caveripatam, and was about to ascend the ghauts by the Tabour Pass, Tippoo came down by that very route, slipped past them, and is marching on to Trichinopoly. That being the case, I see no further utility in your remaining with your troop in the passes, but think it were best that you should reassemble them at once and march here. There is no chance of Tippoo capturing Trichinopoly before Meadows, who is following him, can come up and force on a battle, so it is likely that the Mysore army may continue their march in this direction, in which case every fighting man will be of use to defend this place until it is relieved by the general." Dick uttered an exclamation of disgust as he laid the letter down. "It does not matter about my news turning out wrong," he said, "but it is very bad that General Meadows should have allowed Tippoo to pass him, as he may do frightful damage to the country before he can be overtaken." "He never can be overtaken as long as he chooses to keep ahead. He is hampered with no baggage train. He lives on the plunder of the country he passes through, and the British army with all its baggage and provision train has no more chance of overtaking him than it has of flying." Messengers were at once sent off to call in the scattered portions of the troop. These were assembled in 24 hours and at once started for Arcot, where they arrived after a 2 days' march. There they learned that Tippoo had appeared before Trichinopoly, and after pillaging and laying waste the sacred island of Seringam, had marched north. Day after day news arrived of the devastation of his committing on his march. At Thiagur, however, he met with a serious repulse. Great numbers of the inhabitants from the surrounding country had crowded into the town with their valuables, and Tippoo, expecting a rich booty, attacked the town. But although its fortifications were insignificant, the little garrison was commanded by Captain Flint, the officer who had so bravely defended Wandiwash in the previous war, and 2 assaults were repulsed with serious loss. At Trinley, 35 miles further north, he was more successful, capturing the town and putting the inhabitants to the sword. Here Tippoo changed his course and marched for Pondicherry, capturing Permacoil by the way. The news that Tippoo had changed his course to the southeast was received with great joy at Arcot. Although confident that this capital would be able to resist any sudden attack, the belief had been general that the whole territory would be laid waste, as it had been by Hyder, and hopes were now entertained that the British army would arrive in time to bar Tippoo's further progress. Chapter 8: The Invasion of Mysore. For some time there was a pause in the hostilities. Tippoo remained with his army near Pondicherry, carrying on negotiations with the French governor, and arranging for the dispatch of an envoy to France, with a request that the Republic would furnish him with 6,000 French troops. While he was thus wasting his time, General Meadows was slowly moving with the army towards an encampment formed at Valout, some 18 miles west of Madras. On the 14th of December a messenger arrived with the news that Lord Cornwallis had arrived from Calcutta 2 days before, with considerable reinforcements, and that he was about to assume the supreme command of the army. The news caused unbounded satisfaction. By the extreme dilatoriness of his movements, and especially by the manner in which he allowed Tippoo to pass him near Caveripatam, when he might easily have attacked him, while his troops were still struggling through the pass, General Meadows had disgusted his troops. He had frittered away, without striking a single blow, the finest army that the British had, up to that time, ever put into the field in India, and had enabled Tippoo, unmolested, to spread destruction over a large extent of country. The only countervailing success that had been gained by the British was a brilliant victory won by Colonel Hartley, who was in command of a Bombay force consisting of a European regiment and 2 battalions of sepoys. With these he engaged Hussain Ali, who had been left by Tippoo in Malabar, with a force of 9,000 men, when the Sultan first retreated before General Meadows' advance. This force was defeated with a loss of 1,000 men killed and wounded, 900, including Hussain himself, taken prisoners on the field, and 1,500 more in the pursuit, the total British loss being only 52 men. A few days after this victory, General Abercrombie arrived from Madras with reinforcements, and the whole of Tippoo's fortified palaces in Malabar were captured, one after another, and the entire province conquered. As soon as Lord Cornwallis reached the camp at Vellout, with a large train of draft animals that had been brought up by sea from Calcutta, the Rajah and his troops received orders to join him. It was on the 29th of January, 1791, that the Commander-in-Chief arrived at Vellout, and the Rajah arrived there on the 4th of February. As he was the bearer of a letter from the Resident at Arcot, he was at once enabled to have an interview with Lord Cornwallis. On finding that he could speak English, the general received him with much courtesy. "I am glad, indeed, to have a troop like yours with us, Rajah," he said. "There are few of my officers who know anything of this part of the country, and your local knowledge will be invaluable. Moreover, as I do not speak the language myself, it will be a great advantage to have someone with me through whom I can communicate freely with the people of the country. There is no doubt that such communications are much more effectual when they come through one of their own princes than through English officers. I shall therefore order that on the march a space be allotted for the encampment of your troop by the side of that occupied by my own escort, and hope that when not employed on scouting or other duties, you will ride with my staff." "Your mother, Rajah, was an English lady, I am told?" "She was, sir. My sister, who married an Englishman, is at present in Madras with my family, and her son is with me." "I beg to recommend him to your lordship. He speaks my language perfectly, and having been brought up in his father's country, naturally speaks English as well as Hindustani, and will understand far better than I can do any orders that you may give. He has come out with his mother in the hopes of finding his father, who has, if alive, been a prisoner for several years in the hands of Tippoo. He is a fine young fellow. The other day he made a most dangerous reconnaissance into Mysore, in order to ascertain Tippoo's movements. He had with him a young officer of mine, 2 or 3 years older than himself, and when I tell you that the 2 young fellows held a ruined hut for hours against the attack of some 70 of Tippoo's troops, and beat them off with a loss of upwards of 20 killed, I need hardly say that he has no lack of courage." "You are right indeed, Rajah. Let the lad ride beside you with my staff. Some day he will perhaps shorten a long day's march by giving me details of this adventure of his." On the 5th day of February the army started on its march, and on the 11th reached Vellore. Tippoo had for 2 months been wasting his time at Pondicherry, but upon hearing news that, instead of, as he expected, the English general having marched south from Vellout to meet him, he had turned westward, and that Mysore itself was threatened with invasion, he hastily broke up his camp and marched at full speed for the Ghauts, and reaching the tableland hurried to oppose the British army as it endeavoured to ascend the pass going from Vellore through Amboor, by which he made sure he would come. Lord Cornwallis encouraged him in the idea by sending a battalion of considerable distance up the pass, while he started north and entered the easy pass of Moogly, leading west from Chittoor to Moolwagli. He pushed rapidly up the pass, and gaining the summit before Tippoo could reach the spot and oppose him. It took 4 days longer for the battering train, baggage, and provisions to reach the top of the pass, after a delay of a day or 2 to rest the animals, which included 67 elephants which had been brought from Bengal. The army set out for Bangalore, the second largest town in Mysore. The Rajah's troops had been busily employed from the time the army moved from Vellout. The men on their tireless little horses carried his messages to the various divisions and brigades, brought up news of the progress of the train, or rode on ahead with the officers of the quartermaster's department, whose duty it was to precede the army, to decide on the camping ground, and to mark off the spots to be occupied by the various corps. In this way they saved the regular cavalry from much fatiguing duty. Surajah and Dick were generally with the party that went on with the quartermasters, and as soon as the camping ground was fixed upon, aided them in the purchase of forage and food from the natives, as it was most desirable that the 40 days' provisions the army carried with it should remain intact until the army had passed up the Ghauts. Beyond that, it was expected that it would be harassed by the Mysore horse, who would render it impossible for the cavalry to go out to collect forage or provisions from the country through which it marched. So well did the Rajah's troop perform its duties that Lord Cornwallis ordered it to be taken on the strength of the army, and to receive the pay and rations of native cavalry in the service. On the day after leaving Vellore, the general sent an orderly to request the Rajah and his nephew to ride with him. "I have not had an opportunity of hearing of your scouting expedition," he said to Dick, "and shall be glad if you will give me full details of it." Dick related the adventure from the time they had started. "You were wonderfully lucky in getting back safely," the general said, when he had finished. "At least, luck is not the proper word, for your safety was due to your quick-wittedness and courage, and your escape with your companion from the guardhouse, the manner in which you got through the fort in the pass, and your defence of that hut until the Rajah's troop arrived to your rescue, were all of them admirably managed." He then proceeded to inquire further into the object for which Dick had come out to India. "I heartily wish you success in your search," he said, "and sincerely hope we may obtain news of your father. I do not know what your intentions may be afterwards, but should you wish to enter the army, I will at once nominate you to a commission in one of our native cavalry regiments." "I am deeply obliged to your excellency," Dick replied, "but as, if we learn nothing of my father during the war, I am quite resolved to spend, if necessary, some years in Mysore in the search for him, I must therefore be free to devote my time to that." "At any rate," the general said, "if at any time you should feel free to accept my offer, it will be open to you. In the meantime, I will appoint you one of the interpreters to the army during the expedition, and will attach you to my own staff. It will give you a recognized position, and it is only right that, as you are doing good service, you should receive pay. You shall be put in orders this evening. You can, of course, continue to camp and live with the Rajah." The change made very little difference in Dick's duties, and he continued at his former work in the quartermaster's department until the army was ready for its advance to Bangalore. To the general's surprise, as the army moved forward, nothing was seen of Tippoo's cavalry, by which they had expected to be continually harassed. The sultan had, as soon as he perceived that Bangalore was threatened, hurried the whole army to that city, where he had sent his harem when he started from Seringapatam to attack Travancore, and instead of sending off a few hundred horsemen to escort them to the capital, while with his army he opposed the advance of the British, he took his whole force with him in order to remove his harem with all the pomp and ceremony with which their passage through the country was generally accompanied. Consequently, it was not until after taking, without resistance, the forts of Kolar and Uskota, and arriving within 10 miles of Bangalore, that the army actually encountered Tippoo's cavalry. This was on the 4th of March. They made an attempt to reach the baggage trains, but were sharply repulsed, and on the following day the army took up its position before Bangalore. As they approached the town, 3 horsemen dashed out from a small grove and rode furiously towards a little group, consisting of Lord Cornwallis, General Meadows, and the staff, who were reconnoitring at some little distance from the head of the column. It was evident that their intention was to cut down the general. The Rajah, who was riding as usual with the staff, dashed forward with 4 or 5 other officers, and encountered the horsemen before they could reach the general. The Rajah cut down one of them, another was killed by one of the staff, and the third knocked off his horse and captured. It was learned that the enterprise was not a planned one, but was the result of a quarrel between the men themselves. One had charged the others with cowardice, and in return they had challenged him to follow them where they dared go. All had prepared themselves for the enterprise by half intoxicating themselves with bhang, and thus made but a poor fight, when they found their object thwarted by the officers, who threw themselves between them and their intended victim. Bangalore was a fine town, situated on a plain so elevated that the climate was temperate, the soil fertile, and vegetation abundant. The town was of considerable extent, that portion lying within the fortifications being 1.25 miles long by half a mile broad. It was surrounded by a strong rampart, a thick hedge, and a deep dry ditch. The wall, however, did not extend across the side facing the fort, whose guns were supposed to render it ample protection. The fort was oval in shape, and about 900 yards across at its greatest diameter. It was defended by a broad rampart, strengthened by 30 semicircular bastions and 5 outworks. The 2 gates, one at each end, were also protected by outworks. In the fort stood the splendid palace built by Tippoo. Here also were immense foundries of cannon, factories for muskets, the arsenal, and large magazines of grain and ammunition. The position taken up by the army lay to the northeast of the Petah, or town, and the next morning a reconnoitring party, escorted by Colonel Floyd with the whole of the cavalry and a brigade of infantry, went out to examine the defences of the town and the fort. Seeing a large body of laden elephants and camels, escorted by a strong body of horsemen, Colonel Floyd rode with the cavalry to attack them. The movement was a rash one, as the guns on the fort opened fire, and although at first he defeated the Mysore horse, a heavy fire was poured upon him when entangled in broken ground. He himself was shot by a musket ball which, striking him in the face, passed through both jaws. It was at first believed he was dead, but he was carried back to camp and ultimately recovered. This rash attack cost the lives of 71 men and of 4 times as many horses. As Tippoo's army was lying at a distance of only 6 miles away, the general determined that it would be best in the first place to capture the town without delay, and to assault the fort on that side, as he could then do so without any fear of an attack by Tippoo, who would be able to harass him constantly were he approached the fort from any other direction. Orders were therefore issued for the 36th Regiment, supported by the 26th Bengal Sepoys, and a party of artillery under Colonel Moorhouse, to prepare to storm the north gate of the town at daybreak the next morning. As soon as dawn broke, the troops rushed against the gate. The outside work was speedily stormed, but as they issued from it toward the gate itself, they were received with a very heavy fire from the walls, together with a storm of hand grenades. Colonel Moorhouse brought forward a 6-pounder, receiving 2 wounds as the price was run up to the gate. The first time it was fired it had no effect beyond making a small hole, and the next shot had no greater success. Colonel Moorhouse ordered a 12-pounder to be brought up, but as he was aiding to put it into position, another ball struck him and he fell dead. While the artillerymen were pouring shot after shot into the gate, the roar of musketry was unceasing, the 36th keeping up an incessant fire upon the enemy upon the wall, in order to cover as much as possible the operations of the gunners. At last the gate gave way, the troops poured in, cheering loudly, and the enemy at once fled. Many, however, took up their positions in the houses and kept up a galling fire until their places of refuge were stormed by detachments of troops scattered through the town. By 9 o'clock all was over, and the town completely in the possession of the British. Tippoo, furious at its having been so speedily captured, moved down early in the afternoon with a strong force of infantry, and, marching along by the side of the fort, endeavoured to force his way into the town through the open space at that end. He was aided by the guns of the fort, while his artillery kept up a heavy cannonade upon the British encampment. When the Sultan was seen marching toward the town with the evident intention of endeavouring to retake it, the 76th Regiment was sent in to reinforce the garrison, and the 3 battalions opposed so steady a resistance to Tippoo's infantry that the latter were forced to fall back, after sustaining a loss of some 500 men. The troops began next morning to erect batteries. The position was a singular one. A small army was undertaking the siege of a strong fortress, while an army vastly outnumbering it was watching them, and was able at any moment to throw large reinforcements into the fort through the Mysore gate, which was at the opposite end of the fort to that attacked, and the efforts of the British being directed against the Delhi gate, which faced the town. The advantage which had been gained by the employment of the great train carrying the provisions for the troops was now manifest, for unless the army had been so provided, it would have been forced to retreat, as in the face of Tippoo's army with its great host of cavalry it would have been impossible to gather provisions. The first batteries erected by the engineers proved to be too far distant from the wall of the fort to effect any material damage, and others were commenced at a much shorter range. The work was performed with great difficulty, for the guns of the defenders were well served, and a storm of missiles were poured night and day into the town and against the batteries. The garrison, which consisted of 8,000 men, were frequently relieved by fresh troops from the Sultan's army, and were thus able to maintain their fire with great vigour. On the 17th, Tippoo cannonaded the British camp from a distance, but without doing great damage. In the meantime, the fire of our siege guns was steadily doing its work, in spite of the heavy fire kept up on them. The stone facing of the bastion next to the gateway was soon knocked away, but the earth banks behind, which were very thick and constructed of a tough red clay, crumbled but slowly. Still, the breach was day by day becoming more practicable, and Tippoo, alarmed at the progress which had been made, moved his army down toward the east side of the fort, and seemed to meditate an attack upon our batteries. He placed some heavy guns behind a bank surrounding a large tank, and opened some embrasures through which their fire would have taken our trenches, which were now pushed up close to the fort, in the flank. Lord Cornwallis at once directed a strong force to advance, as with the intention of attacking the new work, and Tippoo ordered his troops to retire from it. It was evident, however, that he had determined to give battle in order to save the fort, and the English general therefore determined to storm the place that very night, the 21st of March. The preparations were made secretly, lest the news should be taken to Tippoo by one of the natives in the town, and it was not until late in the evening that orders were issued to the troops which were to take part in the assault. The column was to be composed of the grenadier and light companies of all the European regiments, and these were to be followed and supported by several battalions of sepoys. The force, commanded by Colonel Maxwell, at 11 o'clock issued from the town and advanced through the trenches. The besieged were vigilant, and the instant the leading party sprang from the trenches, and in the bright moonlight ran forward to the breach, a number of blue lights were lighted all along the ramparts, and a heavy musketry fire was opened. The scene was eagerly watched by the troops in the camp, every feature being distinctly visible. The storming party could be seen rushing up the breach and mounting by ladders over the gateway, which was the central object of attack. The enemy gathered in masses at the top of the breach, but as soon as the stormers collected in sufficient strength and charged them with the bayonet, they broke and dispersed. The grenadiers moved along the ramparts to the right, clearing it of its defences as they went along. The light companies did the same along the ramparts to the left, while the sepoys descended into the body of the fort. The whole of the defenders fled toward the Mysore gate at the other end of the fort, and when the three bodies of troops met there, they found the gate blocked by the masses of fugitives. They charged them on all sides. The governor, a brave old soldier and a great favourite of the Sultan, died fighting gallantly to the last. 600 of the garrison fell, and 300, for the most part wounded, were taken prisoners. The British loss was only 50 officers and men killed and wounded. The body of the governor was found next morning among the slain, and Lord Cornwallis sent a message to Tippoo with an offer to have the body carried to his camp for burial. Tippoo, however, replied that the proper place for a soldier to be buried was where he fell, and accordingly the brave old soldier was laid to rest in the fort by the Mohammedan troops in the Sepoy regiment, with all military honours. While the assault was going on, Tippoo, who, in spite of the precautions taken, had received news of the intention of the general, and had warned the garrison of the fort to be prepared, dispatched 2 heavy columns as soon as the fire opened to attack the British camp on its flank. The movement had been foreseen and prepared against, and the attacks were both repulsed with heavy loss. The capture of the fort was effected but just in time, for the provisions were almost entirely consumed, and the scanty rations were eked out by digging up the roots of grasses and vegetables within the circuit of our pickets. The draft and carriage cattle were dying daily by the hundreds. The few remaining, intended for food, were in so emaciated a state that the flesh was scarcely eatable, and, worst of all, the supply of ammunition was almost exhausted. The news of the fall of the fortress, considered by the natives to be almost impregnable, under the very eyes of the Sultan himself and his great army, produced a widespread effect, greatly depressing the spirit of Tippoo's adherents, while it proportionately raised those of the British troops, and excited the hopes of the peoples conquered by Tippoo and his father. One result was that the polagars, or chiefs of a tribe that had but recently fallen under the yoke of Mysore, were at once emboldened to bring in provisions to the town. As great stores were found in the magazines in the fort, the starving animals regained some of their condition during the 10 days that the troops were occupied in repairing the breaches, burying the dead, and placing the fort in a condition to stand a siege, should Tippoo return during the absence of the army. When this was done, and the stores of ammunition replenished from the magazines, the army started on its march north to Dianhully, where they were to effect a junction with the cavalry that the Nizam had agreed to furnish. As it marched, it passed within 3 miles of Tippoo's army, which was proceeding in a westerly direction. Tippoo could here have brought on a general engagement had he wished it, but the capture of Bangalore had for the time cowed his spirit, and he continued his march at a rate that soon placed him beyond the reach of the British. At Dianhully a junction was effected with the Nizam's horse, 10,000 in number. These proved, however, of no real utility, being a mere undisciplined herd, who displayed no energy whatever except in plundering the villages. The united force now moved southeast to guard a great convoy which was advancing up the pass of Amboor, and when this had been met, returned to Bangalore. During the operations of the siege, the Rajah's troop had been rather inactive, and Dick's duties as interpreter had been nominal. At Bangalore no English prisoners had been found, and he was heartily glad when he heard that it was the intention of Lord Cornwallis to march directly upon Seringapatam. It was indeed a necessity for the English general to bring the campaign to a speedy termination. The war was entailing a tremendous strain upon the resources of the company. The Nizam and the Mahrattis were not to be depended upon in the slightest degree, and might at any moment change sides. The French Revolution had broken out, and all Europe was alarmed, and many of the English regiments might at any moment be ordered to return home. Therefore anything like a thorough conquest of Mysore was impossible, and there was only time to march to Seringapatam, to capture Tippoo's capital, and to dictate terms to him. Immense exertions were made to restore the efficiency of the baggage train, and on the 3rd of May the army marched from Bangalore. Tippoo, devoured alike by rage and fear, had taken no efficient steps to meet the coming storm. His first thought was to prevent the English from discovering the brutal cruelty with which his white captives had been treated. He had, over and over again, given the most solemn assurances that he had no white prisoners in his hands, and he now endeavoured to prevent their obtaining evidence of his falsehood and cruelty by murdering the whole of those who remained in his hands at Seringapatam. Having effected this massacre, he next ordered all the pictures that he had caused to be painted on the walls of his palace and other buildings, holding up the English to the contempt and hatred of his subjects, to be obliterated, and he also ordered the bridge over the northern loop of the Cauvery to be destroyed. He then set out with his army to bar the passage of the British to Seringapatam. The weather was extremely bad when the British started. Rainstorms had deluged the country, and rendered the roads well nigh impassable, and the movement was, in consequence, very slow. Tippoo had taken up a strong position on the direct road, and in order to avoid him, Lord Cornwallis took a more circuitous route, and Tippoo was obliged to fall back. The whole country through which the English passed had been wasted. The villages were deserted, and not an inhabitant was to be met with. Suffering much from wet and the immense difficulties of bringing on the transport, the army on the 13th of May arrived on the Cauvery, 9 miles east of Seringapatam. Here it had been intended to cross the river, but the rains had so swollen the stream that it was found impossible to ford it. It was therefore determined to march to a point on the river 10 miles above Seringapatam, where it was hoped that a better ford could be found, and where a junction might be effected with General Abercrombie's Bombay army, which was moving up from the Malabar coast, and was but 30 or 40 miles distant. To effect this movement it was necessary to pass within sight of the capital. Tippoo came out and took up a strong position on a rugged and almost inaccessible height. In front was a swamp stretching to the river, while batteries had been thrown up to sweep the approaches. By a night march, accomplished in the midst of a tremendous thunder and rainstorm, Lord Cornwallis turned Tippoo's position. The confusion occasioned by the storm, however, and the fact that several of the corps lost their way, prevented the full success hoped for from being attained, and gave Tippoo time to take up a fresh position. Colonel Maxwell led 5 battalions up a rocky ledge, held by a strong body of the Mysore troops, carried it at the point of the bayonet, and captured some guns. Tippoo immediately began to fall back, but would have lost the greater portion of his artillery had not the Nizam's horse moved forward across the line by which the British were advancing. Here they remained in an inert mass, powerless to follow Tippoo, and a complete barrier to the British advance. So unaccountable was their conduct that it was generally believed in the army that it was the result of treachery, and it was with difficulty that the British troops could be restrained from firing into the horde of horsemen, who had, from the time they joined the force, been worse than useless. As soon as the British could make their way through or round the obstacle of their advance, they pursued the retreating force of Tippoo until it took refuge under the guns of the works round Seringapatam. Their loss had been 2,000, that of the British 500. But the success was of little benefit to the latter. The terrible state of the roads and the want of food had caused the death of great numbers of draught animals, and the rest were so debilitated as to be absolutely useless. And during the 2 days' march that were required to reach the point on the river previously determined upon, the battering train and almost the whole of the carts were dragged along by the troops. The position of the army was bad in the extreme. Neither food nor forage were to be obtained from the country round. The troops were almost on famine rations, worn out by fatigue and by the march through heavy rains, and nights spent on the sodden ground. Tippoo's horsemen hovered round them. The cavalry of the Nizam, which had been specially engaged to keep the foe at a distance, never once ventured to engage them. It was absolutely impossible to communicate with General Abercrombie, and after remaining but a couple of days in his new camp, Lord Cornwallis felt that the army could only be saved from destruction by immediate retreat. No time was lost in carrying out the decision once arrived at. Some natives were paid heavily to endeavour to make their way to Abercrombie, with orders for him to retire down the Ghauts again into Malabar. Then the whole of the battering train and the heavy equipments were destroyed, and on the 26th of May the army started for its long march back to Bangalore. It had made but 6 miles when a body of horsemen, some 2,000 strong, were seen approaching. Preparations were instantly made to repel an attack, when a soldier rode in and announced that the horsemen were the advanced party of 2 Mahratta armies close at hand. This was welcome news indeed, for Cornwallis had no idea that the Mahrattas were within 200 miles of him, and had come to believe that they had no intention whatever of carrying out their engagements. They had, it appeared, sent off a messenger every day to inform him of their movements, but so vigilant were Tippoo's cavalry that not one of them ever reached the British. In a few hours the junction was completed, and the sufferings of the army were at an end. Stores of every kind were abundant with the Mahrattas, and not only food but clothing and every necessity of life could be purchased in the great bazaars occupied by the Mahratta traders who accompanied the army. Had the 2 Mahratta armies arrived a couple of days earlier, the destruction of the siege train would have been avoided, Seringapatam would have been besieged, Abercrombie's army of 8,000 men have joined, and the war brought at once to a conclusion. It was now, however, too late. The means for prosecuting the siege of so powerful a fortress were altogether wanting, and the united armies returned by easy marches to Bangalore. On the march, the future plan of operations were decided upon. Lord Cornwallis sent orders for the sum of 1,500,000 rupees that had been intended for China to be at once dispatched to Bangalore for the use of the army and the allies. The larger of the Mahratta forces, under Purseram Bhow, with a detachment of Bombay troops that had accompanied it, were to march to the northwest and reduce some of the forts and towns still held by the troops of Mysore. The other Mahratta force, consisting chiefly of cavalry under Hari Punt, were to remain at Bangalore. The cause of the long delay on the part of the Nizam and the Mahrattis was now explained. The Nizam's troop had spent 6 months in the siege of the fortress of Kabul, while an equal time had been occupied by Purseram Bhow in the siege of Durwar, a very strong place garrisoned by 10,000 men. Tippoo began negotiations immediately after his defeat near Seringapatam, and these were continued until July, when they were finally broken off. Some months were occupied in reducing a number of the hill forts, commanding the entrances to the various passes. Among these, 2, deemed absolutely impregnable, Savandroog and Nundigrug, were captured, but the attack upon Kisnageri was repulsed, with considerable loss. By the capture of these places, Lord Cornwallis obtained access to supplies from the Malabar and Carnatic coasts, and was thus free from the risk of any recurrence of the misfortunes that had marred his previous attempt to lay siege to Seringapatam. And on the 5th day of February, 1792, he again came within sight of Tippoo's capital. Chapter 9. News of the Captive. During the 9 months that had elapsed since the retreat from before Seringapatam, Dick had been occupied in following out the main object of his presence in Mysore. Finding that Purseram Bhow's army was the first that would be engaged in active service, he asked permission from the general to join it. This was at once granted, and Lord Cornwallis introduced him to the officer in command of the Bombay troops attached to that army, informing him of the object they had in view. "You'll not be much use as an interpreter," Cornwallis said, "for as the country in which you are going to operate formed until lately a part of the Mahratta dominions, Mahratti will be principally spoken. He will, therefore, go simply as an officer of my staff, attached for the present to your command. He has asked me to allow him to take with him 20 men belonging to the troop of his uncle, the Rajah of Tripatli. His object in doing so is that he will be able to traverse the country independently, and can either rejoin me here, or go to one of the other columns operating against the hill forts, if it should seem to him expedient to do so. Should you desire to make a reconnaissance at any time while he is with you, you will find him useful as an escort, and will not be obliged to ask Purseram Bhow for a party of his cavalry." Dick was sorry to leave his uncle, whose tent he had now shared for the last 10 months. He found himself, however, very comfortable with the Bombay troops, being made a member of the mess, consisting of the officer in command and the 4 officers of his staff. Wishing to have some duties with which to occupy himself, he volunteered to act as an aide-de-camp, and although the work was little more than nominal, it gave him some employment. When not otherwise engaged, he generally rode with Surajah, whom his uncle had appointed to command the 20 troopers. In the year that had elapsed since his arrival in India, Dick had grown considerably and broadened out greatly, and was now a powerful young fellow of over 17. He had, since the troop joined the army of Lord Cornwallis, exchanged his civilian dress for the undress uniform of an officer, which he had purchased at the sale of the effects of a young lieutenant on the general's staff, who had died just as the army arrived before Bangalore. It was indeed necessary that he should do this, riding about as he did, either on the staff of the general or with the officers of the quartermaster's department. There would be no difficulty in renewing his uniform, for hardship, fever, and war had carried off a large number of officers as well as men, and the effects were always sold by auction on the day following the funeral. Many hill fortresses were captured by the Mahrattis, but few offered any resistance, as their commanders knew well that there was no chance of their being relieved, while the men were, in most cases, delighted at the prospect of an escape from their enforced service, and of freedom to return to their homes. In a few of these forts English captives were found. Some had been there for years, their very existence being apparently forgotten by the tyrant. Some had been fairly treated by the Mysore governor, and where this was the case the latter was furnished by the British officers with papers testifying to the kindness with which they had treated the prisoners, and recommending them to the officers of any of the allied forces they might encounter on their way home, or when established there. Upon the other hand, some of the prisoners were found to have been all but starved, and treated with great brutality. In 2 cases, where the captives said that some of their companions had died from the effects of the ill treatment they had received, the governors were tried by court-martial and shot, while some of the others they sentenced to be severely flogged. Every captive released was closely scrutinized by Dick and eagerly questioned. From one of them he obtained news that his father had certainly been alive 4 years previously, for they had been in prison together in a hill fort near Bangalore. "I was a civilian and he a sailor," he said. "Consequently neither of us were of any use to drill in Tipu's battalions, and had been sent up there. Your father was well then. The governor was a good fellow, and we had nothing much to complain of. Mr. Holland was a favourite of his, for being a sailor he was handy at all sorts of things. He could mend a piece of broken furniture, repair the lock of a musket, and make himself generally useful. He left there before I did, as the governor was transferred to some other fort. I never heard where it was, and he took your father with him. I don't know whether he had Tipu's orders to do so, or whether he took him simply because he liked him. At any rate, he was the only prisoner who went with him. The rest of us remained there till a few months back, when the fort was abandoned. It was just after the capture of Bangalore, and the place could have offered no resistance if a body of troops had been sent against it. At any rate, an order arrived one morning, and a few hours afterwards the place was entirely abandoned, and we in the garrison marched here." "My father was quite well?" "Oh yes, quite well. He used to talk to me at times of trying to make his escape, but being a sailor I have no doubt that he could have got down from the precipice on which the fort stood, but he knew that if he did so we should all suffer for it, and probably be all put to death as soon as Tipu heard that one of us had escaped, for that was always done in order to deter prisoners from trying to get away." "Do you think there is any chance of his being alive?" "Well, that's more than I can possibly say. You see, we've not known much of what's passing outside our prison. Some of the guards were good-natured enough, and would occasionally give us a scrap of news, but we heard most from the ill-tempered ones, who delighted in telling us anything they knew that would give us pain. 3 or 4 months ago we heard that every white prisoner in Seringapatam had been put to death by Tipu's orders, and that doubtless there would be a similar clearance everywhere else. But then, again, we were told that the English had retreated, beaten from before Seringapatam, and that the last of them would soon be down the ghauts, but whether the prisoners have been killed in other hill forts like this I cannot say, although I suppose not. Well, we should not have escaped. Certainly no such orders can have been sent to the forts here, for we found a few prisoners in several of them. Of course, it may be otherwise in the forts near the capital, which Tipu might have thought were likely to fall into our hands, while he may not have considered it worthwhile to send the same orders to places so far away as this, where no British force was likely to come. Still, at any rate, it's a great satisfaction that my father was alive 4 years ago, and that he was in kind hands. That's all in favour of my finding him still alive in one of the places we shall take, for Lord Cornwallis intends to besiege some of the fortresses that command the passes, because he cannot undertake another siege of Seringapatam until he can obtain supplies freely and regularly from beyond the ghauts. As nothing whatever can be obtained from the country round here, so completely is it wasted by Tipu's cavalry, I have therefore great hopes that my father may still be found in one of these forts." "I hope indeed that you may find him. I am convinced that the governor would save his life if he could do so, Though, on the other hand, he would, I'm sure, carry out any order he might receive from the Tippoo. Of course, he may not be in charge of a fort now, and may have been appointed colonel of one of the regiments. However, it's always better to hope that things will come as you wish them, however unlikely it may seem that they'll do so. We've been living on hope here, though the chances of our ever being released were small indeed. Of course, we didn't even know that Tippoo and the English were at war until we heard that an English army was besieging Bangalore. And even then we all felt that even if Tippoo were beaten and forced to make peace, it would make no difference to us. He kept back hundreds of prisoners when he was defeated before, and would certainly not surrender any he now holds unless compelled to do so. And no one would be able to give information as to the existence of captives in these distant forts. And yet, in the teeth of all these improbabilities, we continued to hope, and the hopes have been realized. The capture of the forts by the Mahratta army was abruptly checked. Having so far met with such slight opposition, Purseram Bhow became overconfident, and scattered his force over a wide extent of country, in order that they might more easily find food and forage. In this condition they were suddenly attacked by Tippoo, who took advantage of the English being detained at Bangalore, while the transport train was being reorganized, to strike a blow at the Mahrattis. And the strike was a heavy one. Many of the detached parties were completely destroyed, and the Mahratta general, after gathering the rest to his standard, was forced to retreat until strong reinforcements were sent him from Bangalore. Learning from them that it was probable Lord Cornwallis would advance as soon as they rejoined him, Dick determined to go back to Bangalore, as it was unlikely that, after the severe check they had received, the Mahrattis would resume the offensive for a time. Surajah and the men were glad to return to the troop, and as soon as the Mysorean force returned to Seringapatam, Dick, without waiting for the infantry to get in motion, rode rapidly across the country with his little party. He accompanied the English army during their operations, obtaining permission to do so with the columns engaged in the siege of the hill fortresses, and was present at the capture of all the most important strongholds. To his bitter disappointment, no English prisoners were found in any of them, and it was but too certain that all who might have been there had been massacred, by Tippoo's orders, on the first advance of the British against Seringapatam. Great indeed was the satisfaction of the army when they at last came in sight of the city. The capital of Mysore stood on an island in the river Cauvery. This was 4 miles in length and 2 in breadth. The town stood in its centre, the fort at the northern end. The island was approached by 2 bridges, one close to the fort, the other at the south, both being defended by strong batteries. There were also 3 fords, 2 of these being at the north end of the island, and also defended by batteries. The third was near the centre of the island, a mile below the fort, and leading to the native town. The fort was separated from the rest of the island by a deep ditch cut across it. It was defended by numerous batteries. There were 2 gardens on the island, full of large trees, one of them being the burial place of Hyder Ali. This was connected with the fort by 2 avenues of trees. The country round was flat, a considerable portion being almost level with the river, and devoted to the cultivation of rice, while at other points a forest extended almost to the bank. After obtaining a view from some high ground of the city and of Tippoo's army encamped beyond its walls, the British force took up its position 6 miles to the northwest of the city. No sooner had the army reached their camping ground than Lord Cornwallis with his staff reconnoitred the approaches. A thick hedge, formed by a wide belt of thorny shrubs, interlaced and fastened together by cords, extended from the bank of the river about 1,000 yards above Seringapatam, and, making a wide sweep, came down to it again opposite the other end of the island. It was within the shelter of this formidable obstacle that Tippoo's army was encamped. Within the enclosed space were 7 or 8 eminences, on which strong redoubts had been erected. Fearing that Tippoo might, as soon as he saw the position taken up by the assailants, sally out with his army, take the field, and, as before, cut all his communications, Lord Cornwallis determined to strike a blow at once. At sunset, orders were accordingly issued for the forces to move in 3 columns at 3 o'clock, by which time the moon would be high enough to light up thoroughly the ground to be traversed. The centre column, consisting of 3,700 men, under Lord Cornwallis himself, was to burst through the hedge at the centre of the enemy's position, to drive the enemy before them, and, if possible, to cross the ford to the island with the fugitives. This, however, was not to be done until the centre column was reinforced by that under General Meadows, which was to avoid a strong redoubt at the northwest extremity of the hedge, and, entering the fence at a point between the redoubt and the river, drive the enemy before it until it joined the centre column. Colonel Meadows had 3,300 men under his command. The left column, consisting of 1,700 men under Colonel Maxwell, was first to carry a redoubt on Carrygut Hill, just outside the fence, and, having captured this, to cut its way through the hedge, to cross the river at once with a portion of the centre column. Unfortunately, owing to a misunderstanding as to the order, the officer guiding General Meadows' column, instead of taking it to a point between the northwest redoubt and the river, led it directly at the fort. This was stoutly defended, and cost the British 80 men and 11 officers. Leaving a strong garrison here, the column advanced, but came upon another redoubt of even greater strength and magnitude, and the general, fearing that the delay that would take place in capturing it would entirely disarrange the plan of the attack, thought he had better make his way out through the hedge, march round it to the point where the centre column had entered it, and so give Lord Cornwallis the support he must need, opposed as he was to the whole army of Tippoo. In the meantime, Colonel Maxwell's force had stormed the work on Carrygut Hill, and had made its way through the hedge, suffering heavily as it did so from the fire of a strong body of the enemy concealed in a watercourse. The head of the centre column, under General Knox, after cutting its way through the hedge, pushed on with levelled bayonets, thrust its way through the enemy's infantry, and, mingling with a mass of fugitives, crossed the main ford close under the guns of the fort, and took possession of a village halfway between the town and the fort. Unfortunately, in the confusion, but 3 companies had followed him. The rest of the regiment and 3 companies of sepoys crossed lower down and gained possession of a palace on the bank of the river. The officer in command, however, not knowing that any others had crossed and receiving no orders, waited until day began to break. He then recrossed the river and joined Lord Cornwallis, a portion of whose column, having been reinforced by Maxwell's column, crossed the river nearly opposite the town. As they were crossing, a battery of the enemy's artillery opened a heavy fire upon them, but Colonel Knox, with his 3 companies, charged it in the rear, drove out the defenders, and silenced the guns. All this time Lord Cornwallis was with the reserve of the central column, eagerly waiting the arrival of General Meadows' division. This, in some unaccountable way, had missed the gap in the hedge by which the centre column had entered, and, marching on, halted at last at Carrygut Hill, where it was not discovered until daylight. The Mysore army on its left was still unbroken, and had been joined by large numbers of troops from the centre. On discovering the smallness of the force under Lord Cornwallis, they attacked it in overwhelming numbers, led by Tippoo himself. The British infantry advanced to meet them with the bayonet, and drove them back with heavy loss. They rallied and returned to the attack again and again, but were as often repulsed, continuing their attacks, however, until daylight, when Cornwallis, discovering at last the position of General Meadows, joined him on Carrygut Hill. When day broke, the commanders of the 2 armies were able to estimate the results of the night's operations. On the English side, the only positions gained were the works on Carrygut Hill, the redoubt at the northwest corner of the hedge, another redoubt captured by the centre column, and the positions occupied by the force under Colonels Stewart and Knox at the eastern end of the island. The Sultan found that his army was much reduced in strength, no less than 23,000 men being killed, wounded, or missing. Of these, the missing were vastly the most numerous, for 10,000 Chelahs, young Hindus whom Tippoo had carried off in his raids, and forced to become soldiers and nominally Mohammedans, had taken advantage of the confusion and marched away with their arms to the forest of Coorg. Tippoo made several determined effects to drive Colonel Stewart's force off the island, and to recapture the redoubts, but was repulsed with such heavy loss that he abandoned the attempt altogether, evacuated the other redoubts, and brought his whole army across onto the island. Tippoo now attempted to negotiate. He had already done so a month before, but Lord Cornwallis had refused to accept his advances, saying that negotiation was useless with one who disregarded treaties and violated articles of capitulation. "Send hither," he wrote, "the garrison of Coimbatore, and then we will listen to what you have to say." Lord Cornwallis alluded to the small body of troops who, under Lieutenants Chalmers and Nash, had bravely defended that town when it had been attacked by one of Tippoo's generals. The gallant little garrison had surrendered at last on the condition that they should be allowed to march freely away. This condition had been violated by Tippoo, and the garrison had been marched as prisoners to Seringapatam. The 2 officers had been kept in the fort, but most of the soldiers, and 27 other European captives who had lately been brought in from the hill forts, were lodged in the village that Colonel Knox had first occupied on crossing the river, and had all been released by him. Some of these had been in Tippoo's hands for many years, and their joy at their unexpected release was unspeakable. Preparations were now made for the siege. General Abercrombie was ordered up with a force of 6,000 men, but before his arrival Lieutenant Chalmers was sent in with a letter from Tippoo, asking for terms of capitulation. Negotiations were indeed entered into, but, doubting Tippoo's good faith, the preparations for the siege were continued, and upon the arrival of General Abercrombie's force on the 15th of February, siege operations were commenced at the end of the island still in British possession. A few days afterwards the army was astounded to hear that the conditions had been agreed upon, and that hostilities were to cease at once. So great was the indignation, indeed, that a spirit of insubordination and almost mutiny was evinced by many of the corps. They had suffered extreme hardships, had been engaged in most arduous marches, had been decimated by fever and bad food, and they could scarce believe their ears when they heard that they were to hold their hands, now that after a year's campaigning Seringapatam was at their mercy, and that the man who had butchered so many hundred English captives, who had wasted whole provinces and carried 500,000 people into captivity, who had been guilty of the grossest treachery, and whose word was absolutely worthless, was to escape personal punishment. Still higher did the indignation rise, both among officers and men, when the conditions of the treaty became known, and it was discovered that no stipulation whatever had been made for the handing over of the English prisoners still in Mysore, previous to a cessation of hostilities. This condition, at least, should have been insisted upon, and carried out previous to any negotiations being entered upon. The reasons that induced Lord Cornwallis to make this treaty, when Seringapatam lay at his mercy, have ever been a mystery. Tippoo had proved himself a monster unfit to live, much less to rule, and the crimes he had committed against the English should have been punished by the public trial and execution of their author. To conclude peace with him now was to enable him to make fresh preparations for war, and to necessitate another expedition at enormous cost and great loss of life. Tippoo had already proved that he was not to be bound either by treaties or oaths, and lastly, it would have been thought that, as a general, Lord Cornwallis would have wished his name to go down in posterity in connection with the conquest of Mysore and the capture of Seringapatam, rather than with the memorable surrender of Yorktown, the greatest disaster that ever befell a British army. The conditions were in themselves onerous, and had they been imposed upon any other than a brutal and faithless tyrant, might have been deemed sufficient. Tippoo was deprived of half of his dominions, which were to be divided among the allies, each taking the portions adjacent to their own territory. The sum of £3,300,000 was to be paid for the expenses of the war. All prisoners of the allied powers were to be restored. 2 of Tippoo's sons were to be given up as hostages. Even after they had been handed over, there were considerable delays before Tippoo's signature was obtained, and it was not until Lord Cornwallis threatened to resume hostilities that, on the 18th of March, a treaty was finally sealed. Of the ceded territories, the Mahrattis and the Nizam each took a third as their share, although the assistance they had rendered in the struggle had been but of comparatively slight utility. It may indeed be almost said that it was given to them as a reward for not accepting the offers Tippoo had made them, of joining with him against the British. The British share included a large part of the Malabar coast, with the forts of Calicut and Cananore, and the territory of our ally, the Rajah of Coorg. These cessions gave us the passes leading into Mysore from the west. On the south we gained possession of the fort of Dindigul and the districts surrounding it, while on the east we acquired the tract from Amboor to Karur, and so obtained possession of several important fortresses, together with the chief passes by which Hyder had made his incursions into the Carnatic. Dick felt deeply the absence of any proviso in the treaty that all prisoners should be restored previous to a cessation of hostilities, at the same time admitting the argument of his uncle that, Although under such an agreement some prisoners might be released, there was no means of ensuring that the stipulation would be faithfully carried out. "Oh, see, Dick, no one knows, or has indeed the faintest idea, what prisoners Tippoo still has in his hands. We do not know how many have been murdered during the years Tippoo has reigned. Men who have escaped have, from time to time, brought down news of murders in the places where they had been confined, but they have been known little of what has happened elsewhere. Moreover, we have learned that certainly 50 or 60 were put to death at Seringapatam before we advanced upon it the first time. We know, too, that some were murdered in the hill forts that we have captured, but how many remain alive at the present time we have not the slightest idea. Tippoo might hand over a dozen and take a solemn oath that there was not one remaining, and though we might feel perfectly certain that he was lying, we should be in no position to prove it. The stipulation ought to have been made, if only as a matter of honour, but it would have been of no real efficacy. Of course, if we had dethroned Tippoo and annexed all his territory, we should undoubtedly have got at all the prisoners, wherever they may have been hidden, but we could hardly have done that. It would have aroused the jealousy and fear of every native prince in India. It would have united the Nizam and the Mahrattis against us, and would even have been disapproved of in England, where public opinion is adverse to further acquisitions of territory, and where people are, of course, altogether ignorant of the monstrous cruelties perpetrated by Tippoo, not only upon English captives, but upon his neighbours everywhere. Naturally, I am prejudiced in favour of this treaty, for the handing over of the country from Amboor to Karur, with all the passes and forts, will set us free at Tripataly from the danger of being again overrun and devastated by Mysore. My people will be able to go about their work peacefully and in security, free alike from fear of wholesale invasion or incursions of robber bands from the Ghauts. All my waste lands will be taken up, and my revenue will be trebled. And there's another thing. Now that the English possess territory beyond that of the Nabob of Arcot, and are gradually spreading their power north, there can be little doubt that before long the whole country of Arcot, Travancore, Tanjore, and the other small native powers will be incorporated in the British dominions. Arcot is powerless for defence, and while during the last 2 wars it has been nominally an ally of the English, the Nabob has been able to give them no real assistance whatever, and the burden of his territory has fallen on them. They took the first step when, at the beginning of the present war, they arranged with him to utilize all the resources and collect the revenues of his possessions, and to allow him an annual income for the maintenance of his state and family. This is clearly the first step towards taking the territory into their own hands and managing its revenues, and the same will be done in other cases. Lord Cornwallis, the other day, in thanking me for the services that you and I and the troop have rendered, promised me that an early arrangement should be made by which I should rule Tripataly under the government of Madras instead of under the Nabob. This, you see, will be virtually a step in rank, and I shall hold my land direct from the English, instead of from a prince who has become in fact a puppet in their hands. A few days later the army set off on its march for Mysore, and the same day the Rajah, after making his adieus to Lord Cornwallis, started with his troop for Tripataly, making his way by long marches instead of following the slow progress of the army. After a couple of days at Tripataly, they went down to Madras and brought back the Rajah's household. The meeting between Dick and his mother was one of mixed feeling. It was 20 months since the former had left with his uncle, and he was now nearly 18. He had written whenever there was an opportunity of sending any letters, and although his position as interpreter on the staff of the general had relieved her from any great anxiety on his account, she was glad indeed to see him again. Upon the other hand, the fact that as the war went on, and fortress after fortress had been captured, no news came to her that her hopes had been realized, and that the war had now come to a termination without the mystery that hung over her husband being in any way cleared up, had profoundly depressed Mrs. Holland, and it was with mingled tears of pleasure and sorrow that she fell on his neck on his return to Madras. "You must not give way, Mother," Dick said, as she sobbed out her fears that all hope was at an end. "Remember that you have never doubted he was alive, and that you have always said you would know if any evil fate had befallen him, and I have always felt confident that you were right. There is nothing changed. I certainly have not succeeded in finding him, but we have found many prisoners in some of the little out-of-the-way forts. Now, some of them have been captives quite as long as he has. Therefore, there is no reason whatever why he should not also be alive. I have no thought of giving up the search as hopeless. I mean to carry out our old plans, and certainly I am much better fitted to do so than I was when I first landed here. I know a great deal about Mysore, and though I don't speak the language as a native, I have learned a good deal of it, and can speak it quite as well as the natives of the Ghauts and outlying provinces. Surajah, who is a great friend of mine, has told me that if I go he will go too, and that will be a tremendous help. Anyhow, as long as you continue to believe firmly that Father is still alive, I mean to continue the search for him." "I do believe that he is alive, Dick, as firmly as ever. I have not lost hope in that respect. It's only that I doubt now whether he will ever be found." "Well, that is my business, Mother. As long as you continue to believe that he is still alive, I shall continue to search for him. I have no other object in life at present. It will be quite soon enough for me to think of taking up the commission I have been promised, when you tell me that your feeling that he is alive has been shaken." Mrs. Holland was comforted by Dick's assurance and confident tone, and, putting the thought aside for a time, gave herself up to the pleasure of his return. They had found everything at Tripataly as they had left it, for the Mysore horsemen had not penetrated so far north, before Tippoo turned his course east to Pondicherry. The people had months before returned to their homes and avocations. One evening the Rajah said, as they were all sitting together, "I hear from my wife, Dick, that your mother has told her you shall intend to carry out your original project." "Yes, Uncle, I have quite made up my mind as to that. There are still plenty of places where he may be, and certainly I am a good deal more fitted for travelling about in disguise in Mysore than I was before." The Rajah nodded. "Yes, I think, Dick, you are as capable of taking care of yourself as anyone could be. I hear that Surajah is willing to go with you, and this will certainly be a great advantage. He has proved himself thoroughly intelligent and trustworthy, and I have promised him that some day he shall be captain of the troop. You are not thinking of starting just yet, I suppose?" "Oh, no, Uncle. I thought of staying another month or two before I go off again. Mother says she cannot let me go before that." "I fancy it will take you longer than that, Dick, before you can pass as a native." Dick looked surprised. "Why, Uncle, I did pass as a native 18 months ago." "Yes, you did, Dick, but for how long? You went into shops, bought things, chatted for a short time with natives, and so on. But that is not like living among them. You would be found out before you had been a single day in the company of a native." Dick looked still more surprised. "How, Uncle? What do I do that they would know me by?" "It is not what you do, Dick, but it is what you don't do. You can't sit on your heels, squat, as you call it. This is the habitual attitude of every native. He squats while he cooks. He squats for hours by the fire, smoking and talking. He never stands for any length of time, and, except upon a divan or something of that sort, he never sits down. Before you can go and live among the natives and pass as one for any length of time, you must learn to squat as they do, for hours at a stretch, and I can tell you that it is not by any means an easy accomplishment to learn. I myself have quite lost the power. I used to be able to do it as a boy, but from always sitting on divans or chairs in European fashion, I have got out of the way of it, and I don't think I could squat for a quarter of an hour to save my life." Dick's mother and cousins laughed heartily, but he said seriously, "You are quite right, Uncle. I wonder I never thought of it before. It was stupid of me not to do so. Of course, when I have been talking with Surajah or other officers by a campfire, I have sat on the ground, but I see that it would never do in native dress. I will begin at once." "Wait a moment, Dick," the Rajah said. "There are other things which you will have to practice. You may have to move in several disguises, and must learn to comport yourself in accordance with them. You must remember that your motions are quicker and more energetic than are those of people here. Your walk is different. The swing of the arms, your carriage, are all different from theirs. You are unaccustomed to walk either barefooted or in native shoes. Now, all these things have to be practiced before you can really pass muster. Therefore, I propose that you shall at once accustom yourself to the attire, which you can do in our apartments of an evening. The Rani and the boys will be able to correct your first awkwardnesses, and to teach you much. After a week or two, you must stain your face, arms, and legs, and go out with Rajbolub in the evening. You must keep your eyes open and watch everything that passes, and do as you see others do. When Rajbolub thinks that you can pass muster, you will take to going out with him in the daylight, and so you will come in time to reach a point that it will be safe for you to begin your attempt. Do not watch only the peasants. There is no saying that it may not be necessary to take to other disguises. Observe the traders, the soldiers, and even the fakirs. You will see that they walk each with a different mien. The trader is slow and sober. The man who wears a sword walks with a certain swagger. The fakir is everything by turns. He whines and threatens. He sometimes mumbles his prayers, and sometimes shrieks at the top of his voice. When you are not riding or shooting, lad, do not spend your time in the garden or with the women. Go into the town and keep your eyes open. Bear in mind that you are learning a lesson, and that your life depends upon your being perfect in every respect. As to your first disguise, I will speak to Rajbullub, and he will get it ready by tomorrow evening. The dress of the peasant of Mysore differs little from that here, save that he wears rather more clothing than is necessary in this warm climate. Chapter 10. In Disguise. On the following evening Dick appeared in the room where the others were sitting, in the dress Rajbullub had got for him, and which was similar to that of other peasants. The boys had already been told that he was shortly going on a journey, and that it would be necessary for him to travel in disguise, but had been warned that it was a matter that was not to be spoken of to anyone. The early respect that Dick's strength and activity had inspired them with had been much shaken when they discovered that he was unable either to ride or shoot, but their father's narrative of his adventures when scouting with Surajah had completely reinstated him in their high opinion. When he entered, however, they burst out laughing. The two ladies could not help smiling, and Dick was not long before he joined in the laugh against himself. He had felt uncomfortable enough when he started in an almost similar dress with Surajah, although there was then no one to criticize his appearance, but now, in the presence of his mother and his aunt, he felt strangely uncomfortable. "Never mind, Dick," his uncle said encouragingly. "The boys would feel just as uncomfortable as you do now if they were dressed up in European fashion. Now, while we are talking, make your first attempt at sitting on your heels." Dick squatted down until his knees nearly touched his chest, and a moment later lost his balance and toppled over amid a roar of laughter. Next time he balanced himself more carefully. "That is right, Dick. You will get accustomed to it in time. But you must see already that there is a good deal more to be done than you thought of, before you can pass as a native. Remember, you must not only be able to balance yourself while sitting still, but must be able to use your hands, for cooking purposes, for example, for eating, or for doing anything there may be to do, not only without losing your balance, but without showing that you are balancing yourself." "It is much more difficult than I thought, Uncle. Of course, I have always seen the natives squatting like this, but it seemed so natural that it never struck me it was difficult at all. I say, it's beginning to hurt already. My shin bones are aching horribly." "Yes, that is where the strain comes, my boy, but you have got to stick to it, until your muscles there, which have never been called into play in this way before, get accustomed to the work." "I understand that, Uncle. It is just the same with my arms when I began to climb, but I can't stand this any longer. I can no more get up than I can fly," and Dick rolled over onto his side. Again and again he tried, after a short rest between each trial. As he gave it up and limped stiffly to the divan, he said, "I feel as if someone had been kicking me on the shins, until he had nearly broken them, Mother. I have been kicked pretty badly several times in fights by rough fellows at home in Shadwell, but it never hurt like this," and he rubbed his aching legs ruefully. "Well, Uncle, I am very much obliged to you for putting me up to practicing this position. It seemed to me that it would be quite a simple thing to walk along quietly, and to move my arms about as they do, but I never thought of this. I wonder, Mother, you never told me that, above all things, I should have to learn to squat on my heels for any time. It would not have been so difficult to learn it 5 or 6 years ago, when I was not anything like so heavy as I am now." "It never occurred to me, Dick. I wish it had. I thought I had foreseen every difficulty, but it never once came into my mind that, in order to pass as a native, you must be able to sit like one." "Oh, well, I shall learn in time, Mother," Dick replied cheerfully. "Every exercise is hard at first, but one soon gets accustomed to it." Dick threw himself with his usual energy into his new work. Although of a morning, when he first awoke, his shins caused him the most acute pain, he always spent half an hour in practice. Afterwards he would sit for some time, allowing the water from the tap at the side of the bath to flow upon the aching muscles. Then he would dress, and as soon as breakfast was over, go for a run in the garden. At first it was but a shamble, but gradually the terrible stiffness would wear off, and he would return to the house comparatively well. Of an evening the practice was longer, and was kept up until the aching pain became unendurable. At the end of 4 or 5 days he was scarcely able to walk at all, But after that time matters improved, and 3 weeks later he could preserve the attitude for half an hour at a time. In other respects his training had gone on uninterruptedly every day. He went out into the town, accompanied sometimes by Rajbullub, sometimes by Surajah, in the disguises of either a peasant, a soldier, or a trader, and learnt to walk and carry himself in accordance with his dress. Before putting on these disguises he painted himself with a solution that could easily be washed off on his return to the Palace, where he now always wore a European dress. "You cannot be too careful," the Rajah said. "There are, of course, Mohammedans here, and for aught we know some may act as agents or spies of Tippoo, just as the English have agents and spies in Mysore. Were one of them to send word that you had taken to Indian attire, and that it was believed that you were about to undertake some mission or other, it would add considerably to your difficulties and dangers. As it is, no one outside our own circle ever sees you about with me or the boys except in your European dress, and Rajbullub tells me that in no single instance, while you have been in disguise, has any suspicion been excited, or questions asked, by the people of various classes with whom you and he converse in the streets." Another month passed, and by this time Dick could, without any great fatigue, squat on his heels for an hour at a time. As the date for his departure drew near, his mother became more and more nervous and anxious. "I shall never forgive myself if you do not come back," she said one day, when they were alone. "I cannot but feel that I have been selfish, and that really, on the strength of a conviction which most people would laugh at as whimsical and absurd, I am risking the substance for a shadow, and I am imperilling the life of my only boy upon the faint chance that he may find my husband. I know that even your uncle, although he has always been most kind about it, and assisted in every way in his power, has but little belief in the success of your search, although, as he sees how bent I am upon it, he says nothing that might dash my hopes. If evil comes of it, Dick, I shall never forgive myself. I shall feel that I have sacrificed you to a sort of hallucination." "I can only say, Mother," Dick replied, "that I came out here and entered into your plans only because I had the most implicit faith that you were right. I should now continue it on my own account, even if tomorrow you should be taken from me. Of course, I see plainly enough that the chances are greatly against my ever hearing anything of Father, but from what has taken place during the campaign, I have seen that there must be many British captives still hidden away among the hill forts, and it is quite possible he may be among them. I do not even say that it is probable, but the chances are not so very greatly against it. And even if I thought they were smaller, much smaller than I believe them to be, I should still consider it my duty to go up and try and find him. So even if it should happen that I never come back again, you will not have yourself to blame, for it is not you that are sending me, but I who am going of my own free will, and indeed I feel it so much my duty that, even were you to turn round now and ask me to stay, I should still think it right to undertake this mission." "But indeed, Mother, I see no great danger in it. In fact, scarcely any danger at all, at any rate unless I find Father. If I do so, there might certainly be risk in attempting to get him away, but this, if I am lucky enough in discovering him, will not weigh with me for an instant. If I do not find him, it seems to me that the risk is a mere nothing. Surajah and I will wander about, enlisting in the garrisons of forts, and then if we find there are no prisoners there, we shall take an early opportunity of getting away. In some places, no doubt, I shall be able to learn from men of the garrison whether there are prisoners, without being forced to enter at all, for although in the great forts, like Savandroog and Outradroog, it is considered so important the defences should be kept secret, that none of the garrison are allowed to leave until their discharge is too old for service, there is no occasion for the same precaution in the case of less important ones. Thus, you see, we shall simply have to wander about, keeping our eyes and ears open, and finding out, either from the peasants or the soldiers themselves, whether there are any prisoners there." "Oh, I wish I could go with you, Dick. I used to think that, when the work of searching for your father had begun, I could wait patiently for the result, but instead of that, I find myself even more anxious and more nervous than I was at Shadwell." "I can quite understand, Mother, that it is very much more trying work, sitting here waiting, than it is to be actively engaged. The only thing is that you must promise me not to trouble more than you can help, for if I think of you as sitting here fretting about me, I shall worry infinitely more than I otherwise should over any difficulties we may have to encounter. You must remember that I shall have Surajah with me. He is a capital companion, and will always be able to advise me upon native business. He's as plucky as a fellow can be, and I can trust him to do anything, just as I would myself." The preparations for departure now began in earnest. There was some discussion as to the arms that were to be taken, but at last it was decided that with safety they could carry nothing beyond a matchlock, a pistol, and a sword each. Great pains were taken in the selection of the matchlocks. In the armoury were several weapons of high finish with silver mountings, that had belonged to the Rajah's father and grandfather. These were tried against each other, and the two that were proved to be the most accurate were chosen. Dick found, indeed, that at distances up to 100 yards they were quite equal to the English rifle he had brought out. The silver mountings were taken off, and then the pieces differed in no way in appearance from those in general use among the peasantry. The pistols were chosen with equal care. The swords were of finely tempered steel, the blades being removed from their jewelled handles, for which were substituted rough handles of ordinary metal. 10 gold pieces were sewn up underneath the iron bands encircling the leathern scabbard, as many under the bosses of their shields, and 5 pieces in the soles of each of their shoes. In their waist sashes, the ordinary receptacle of money, each carried a small bag with native silver coins. At last all was ready, and an hour before daybreak Dick took a cheerful farewell of his mother and a hearty one of his uncle, and with Surajah passed through the town and struck up into the hills. Each carried a bag slung over his shoulder, well filled with provisions, a small water bottle, and hung upon his matchlock a change of clothing. In the folds of his turban Dick had a packet of the powder used for making dye, so that he could at any time renew the brown shade when it began to fade out. For a time but few words were spoken. Dick knew that, although his mother had borne up bravely till the last, she would break down as soon as he left her, and the thought that he might never see her again weighed heavily upon him. Surajah, on the contrary, was filled with elation at the prospect of adventures and dangers, and he was silent simply because he felt that, for the present, his young lord was in no humour for speech. As soon as the sun rose, Dick shook off his depression. They were now a considerable distance up the hillside. There was no path, for the people of Tripatli had no occasion to visit Mysore, and still less desire for a visit from the Mysoreans. Periodically raids were made upon the villages and plains by marauders from the hills, but these were mostly by the passes through the ghauts, 30 or 40 miles left or right from the little state which, nestling at the foot of the hills, for the most part escaped these visitations, which, now that the British had become possessed of the territories and the hills, had, it was hoped, finally ceased. Nevertheless, the people were always prepared for such visits. Every cultivator had a pit in which he stored his harvest, except so much as was needed for his immediate wants. The pit was lined with mats, others were laid over the grain. 2 feet of soil was then placed over the mats, and after the ground had been ploughed there was no indication of the existence of the hiding place. The town itself was surrounded by a wall of sufficient strength to withstand the attacks of any parties of marauders, and the custom of keeping a man on a watchtower was still maintained. At the foot of the tower stood a heavy gun, whose discharge would at once warn the peasants for miles round of an enemy, calling those near to hasten to the shelter of the town, while the men of the villages at a distance could hurry, with their wives and families, to hiding places among the hills. Dick and Surajah had no need for a path, for they were well acquainted with the ground, and had often wandered up nearly to the crest of the hills in pursuit of game. An hour before noon they took their seats under a rock that shaded them from the sun's rays, and, sitting down, partook of a hearty meal. There was no occasion for haste, and they prepared for rest until the heat of the day was past. "We are fairly off now, Surajah," Dick said, as he stretched himself out comfortably. "I have been thinking of this almost as long as I can remember, and can hardly believe that it has come to pass." "I have thought of it but a short time, my lord." "No, Surajah," Dick interrupted. "You know it was arranged that, from the first, you were to call me Purseram, for unless you get accustomed to it, you will be calling me my lord in the hearing of others." "I had forgotten," Surajah replied with a smile, and then went on. "It is but a short time since I was sure I was going with you, but I have ever hoped that the time would come when, instead of the dull work of drilling men and placing them on guard, I might have the opportunity of taking part in war and adventure, and indeed had thought of asking my lord, your uncle, to permit me to go away for a while in one of the Company's regiments, and there to learn my business. Since the English have become masters, and there is no longer war between Rajah and Rajah as there used to be in olden times, this is the only way that a man of spirit can gain distinction. But this adventure is far better, for there will be much danger, and need for caution as well as courage." Dick nodded. "More for caution and coolness than for courage, I think, Surajah. It will only be in case we find my father, or if any grave suspicion falls on us that there will be need for courage. Once well into Mysore, I see but little chance of suspicion falling upon us. We have agreed that we will first make for Seringapatam, avoiding as much as possible all places on the way where inquiries whence we come may be made of us. Once in the city we shall be safe from such questions, and can travel thence where we will, and it will be hard if we do not, when there, manage to learn the places at which any prisoners there may be are most likely to be kept. Besides, my father is as likely to be there as anywhere, for Tippoo may, since our army marched away, have ordered all prisoners to be brought down from the hill forts to Seringapatam." When the sun had lost its power, they proceeded on their way again. Their start had been timed so that for the first week they would have moonlight, and would therefore be able to travel at night until they arrived at Seringapatam. It was considered that it was only necessary to do this for the first 2 or 3 nights, as after that the tale that they were coming from a village near the frontier, and were on their way to join Tippoo's army, would seem natural enough to any villagers who might question them. They continued their course until nearly midnight, by which time they were both completely fatigued, and, choosing a spot sheltered by bushes, lay down to sleep. It took another 2 days before they were clear of the broken country, and the greater portion of this part of the journey they performed in daylight. Occasionally they saw in the distance the small forts which guarded every road to the plateau. To these they always gave a very wide berth, as although according to the terms of peace they should all have been evacuated, they might still be occupied by parties of Tippoo's troops. Indeed, all the news that had arrived since the army left represented Tippoo as making every effort to strengthen his army and fortresses, and prepare for a renewal of the war. Several times they saw bears, which abounded among the ghauts, and once beheld 2 tigers crossing a nullah. They had, however, other matters to think of, and neither the flesh nor the skins of the bears would have been of any use to them. The work was severe, and they were glad when at last they reached the level country. In some of the upper valleys opening onto this they had seen small villages. Near one of these they had slept, and as in the morning they saw that the inhabitants were Hindus, they fearlessly went out and talked with them, in order to gain some information as to the position of the forts, and to learn whether any bodies of Tippoo's troops were likely to be met with. They found the people altogether ignorant on these matters. They were simple peasants. Their whole thoughts were given to tilling their land and bringing in sufficient to live upon, and to satisfy the demands of the tax gatherers when they visited them. They had little communication with other villages, and knew nothing of what was passing outside their own. They evinced no curiosity whatever concerning their visitors, who bought from them some cakes of ground ragi, which formed the chief article of their food. The country through which they passed, and on emerging from the hills, was largely covered with bush and jungle, and was very thinly populated. It was an almost unbroken flat, save that here and there isolated masses of rock rose above it. These were extremely steep and inaccessible, and on their summits were the hill forts that formed so prominent a feature in the warfare of both Mysore and the Nizam's dominions to the north. These forts were, for the most part, considered absolutely impregnable, but the last war with the British had proved that they were not so, as several of the strongest had been captured with comparatively slight loss. Whenever they passed within a few miles of one of these hill fortresses, Dick looked at it with anxious eyes, for there, for aught he knew, his father might be languishing. After 2 days' walking across the plain, they felt there was no longer any necessity for concealment, except that it would be as well to avoid an encounter with any troops. Although, therefore, they avoided the principal roads, they kept along beaten paths, and did not hesitate to enter villages to buy food. They no longer saw caste marks on the foreheads of the inhabitants. The Hindus had been compelled by force to abandon their religion, all who refused to do so being put to death at once. Dick and Surajah found that their dialect differed much more from that of the country below the ghauts than they had expected, and although they had no difficulty in conversing with the peasants, they found that their idea that they would be able to pass as natives of one of these villages was an altogether erroneous one. "This will never do, Surajah," Dick said, as they left one of the villages. "We shall have to alter our story somehow, for the first person we meet in Seringapatam will see that we are not natives of Mysore. We must give out that we come from some village far down on the ghauts, one of those which have been handed over to the English by the new treaty. You know the country well enough there to be able to answer any questions that might be asked. We must say that, desiring to be soldiers, and hating the English Raj, we have crossed the hills to take service of some sort in Mysore. This will be natural enough, and of course there are many Mohammedans down in the plains, especially among the villages on the ghauts." "I think that would be best, Purseram." "There is one comfort," Dick went on. "It is evident that Tippoo is hated by all the Hindus. He has forced them to change their religion, and we need have no fear of being betrayed by any of them except from pressure, or from a desire to win Tippoo's goodwill." "Yes, that might be the case with those who are fairly well off, but who scarcely be so among the poorer classes. Besides, even they, were we living among them, would have no reason for suspecting our story. There seems no doubt, from what they say, that Tippoo is preparing for war again, and I think that we shall do well, as soon as we enter the city, to change our attire, or we might be forced into joining the army, which would be the last thing we want. What I should desire above all things is to get service of some kind in the palace." After 6 days' travel, they saw the walls of Seringapatam. Dick had made many inquiries at the last halting place as to the position of the fords on that side of the town, and learned that only those leading to the fort were guarded. The ford opposite the town was freely open to traffic, and could be crossed without question by country people, although a watch was kept to see that none of the very numerous prisoners escaped by it. It was here, therefore, that they crossed the river, the water being little more than knee deep. No questions were asked by the guard as they passed, their appearance differing in no way from that of the peasants of the neighbourhood. After a quarter of a mile's walk, they entered the town. It was open and undefended by a wall. The streets were wide, and laid out at right angles. The shops, however, were poor, for the slightest appearance of wealth sufficed to excite the cupidity of Tippoo or his agents, and the possessor would be exposed to exorbitant demands, which, if not complied with, would have entailed first torture, and then death. The streets, however, presented a busy appearance. They were thronged with soldiers. Battalions of recruits passed along, and it was evident that Tippoo was doing all in his power to raise the strength of his army to its former level. They wandered about for some time, and at last, in a small street, Dick went up to an old man whose face pleased him. He was standing at the door of his house. "We desire to find a room we can lodge for a time," he said. "Can you direct us where we can obtain one?" "You are not soldiers?" the old man asked. "No, we desire to earn our living, but have not yet decided whether to join the army." "You are from the plains?" the natives said sharply, in their own dialect. "That is so." "And yet you are Mohammedans?" "Everyone is Mohammedan here." "Ah, because it is the choice of death or Mohammed. How comes it that two young men should voluntarily leave their homes to enter this tiger's den? You look honest youths. How come you here?" "Well, I trust that we are honest," Dick said. "We have assuredly not ventured here without a reason, and that reason is a good one. But this is not a city where one talks of such matters to a stranger in the street, even though his face tells one that he can be trusted with a secret." The old man was silent for a minute. Then he said, "Come in, my sons. You can, as you say, trust me. I have a room that you can occupy." They followed him into the house, and he led them into a small room at the back. It was poorly furnished, but was scrupulously clean. A pan of lighted charcoal stood in one corner, and over this a pot of rice was boiling. "I bid you welcome," he said gravely. And as the salutation was not one in use by the Mohammedans, Dick saw that his idea that the old man was a Hindu, who had been forced to abjure his religion, was a correct one. The old man motioned to them to take their seats on the divan. "I do not ask for your confidence," he said, "but if you choose to give it to me, it will be sacred, and it may be that, poor as I am able to aid you. I will tell you at once that I am a native of Conjeveram, and of course a Hindu. I was settled as a trader at Mysore, the old capital. But then, 4 years ago, the tyrant destroyed that town. I, with over 100,000 of our religion, was forced to adopt Mohammedanism. I was of high caste, and, like many others, would have preferred death to yielding, had it not been that I had a young daughter, and for her sake I lived, and moved here from Mysore. I gained nothing by my sin. I was one of the wealthiest traders in the whole city, and I had been here but a month when Tippoo's soldiers burst in one day. My daughter was carried off to the Tiger's harem, and I was threatened with torture unless I divulged the hiding place of my money. It was useless to resist. My wealth was now worthless to me, and without hesitation I complied with their demands, and all I had was seized, save for one small hoard, which was enough to keep me thus to the end of my days. My wants are few, a handful of rice or grain a day, and I am satisfied. I should have put an end to my life were it not that, according to our religion, the suicide is accursed, and moreover I would fain live to see the vengeance that must some day fall upon the tyrant. After what I have said, it is for you to decide whether you think I can be trusted with your secret, for I am sure it is for no slight reason that you have come to this accursed city." Dick felt that he could safely speak, and that he would find in this native a very valuable ally. He therefore told his story without concealment, except that an exclamation of surprise broke from his lips when Dick said that he was English. The old man listened without a remark until he had finished. "Your tale is indeed a strange one," he said, when he had heard the story. "I had looked for something out of the ordinary, but assuredly for nothing so strange as this. Truly, your English are a wonderful people. It is marvellous that one should come all the way from beyond the black water to seek for a father lost so many years ago. Methinks that a blessing will surely alight upon such filial piety, and that you will find your father yet alive. Were it not for that, I should deem your search a useless one. Thousands of Englishmen have been massacred during the last 10 years. Hundreds have died of disease and suffering. Many have been poisoned. Many officers have also been murdered, some of them here, but more in the hill forts, for it was there they were generally sent when their deaths were determined upon. Still, your father may live. There are men who have been here as many years, and who yet survive." "Then this is where the main body of the prisoners were kept?" Dick asked. "Yes, all were brought here, native and English. Tens of thousands of boys and youths, swept up by Tippoo's armies from the Malabar coast and the Carnatic, were brought up here and formed into battalions, and these English prisoners were forced to drill them. It was but a poor drill. I have seen them drilling their recruits at Conjeveram, and the difference between the quick sharp order there and the listless command here was great indeed. Consequently, the Englishmen were punished by being heavily ironed, and kept at starvation point for the slackness with which they obeyed the tyrant's orders. Sometimes they were set to sweep the streets, sometimes they were beaten till they were well nigh expired under the lash. Often would they have died of hunger were it not that Tippoo's own troops took pity on them, and supplied them from their store. Some of the boys, drummer boys or ship's boys or little ship's officers, were kept in the palace and trained as singers and dancers for Tippoo's amusement. Very many of the white prisoners were handed over to Tippoo by Admiral Suffren, though how a Christian could have brought himself to hand over Christians to this tiger I cannot imagine. Others were captured in forays, and there were till lately many survivors of the force that surrendered in Hyder's time. There are certainly some in other towns, for it was the policy of Hyder, as it is of Tippoo, always to break up parties of prisoners. Many were sent to Bangalore, some to Burrampore, and very many to the fort of Chilembroom, but I heard that nearly all these died of famine and disease very quickly. While Tippoo at times considers himself strong enough to fight the English, and is said to aim at the conquest of all southern India, he has yet a fear of Englishmen, and he thus separates his captives lest, if they were together, they should plot against him and bring about a rising. He knows that all the old Hindu population are against him, and that even among the Mohammedans he is very unpopular. The Chilla battalions, who numbered 12,000 or 14,000, made up entirely of those he has dragged from their homes in districts devastated by him, would assuredly have joined against him were there a prospect of success, just as they seized the opportunity to desert 6 months ago, when the English attacked the camp across the river. Now, if you will tell me in what way I can best serve you, I will do so. In the first place, sturdy young peasants are wanted for the army, and assuredly you will not be here many days before you will find yourselves in the ranks, whether you like it or not, for Tippoo is in no way particular how he gets recruits.